Hello, Flights of Foundry. Welcome to the No Narrative Required panel. I'm here with the wonderful panelists Valerie Valdez and Anne LeBlanc. Let's start by having y'all introduce yourselves. I'll start with the V's since, V's don't typically get to go first. Valerie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Truly, always at the back end of the alphabetical order. My name is Valerie Valdez. I am the author of the Chilling Effect trilogy and the forthcoming space fantasy Where Peace is Lost. I also stream on Twitch as the kids are asleep, and I do some tabletop role playing as well with the Strange Friends crew.
Excellent. And what about you?
Hi, I'm Anne LeBlanc. I'm a short fiction and interactive fiction writer. I've got stories out in Clark's World, Apparition Lit, Escape Pod, and Baffling, among others. I'm also a woodworker, and yeah, I'm excited to talk about narratives and games.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. And I am Stephen Grenade, he, they. I am an interactive fiction author, a writer, and as of like 10 seconds ago now, a co-editor of a new SFF magazine, Small Wonders. So I'm very excited to dive into this because I think the topic is really rich and interesting. Can a game be speculative without a narrative? Valerie?
Yes.
Anne?
I'm going to say yes.
I would also say yes. Well, everyone, I really appreciate y'all coming to the panel. We'll talk about where we can find each other now after we go a little bit deeper, because I think I'd like to start off by sort of feeling around the edges of this question, definitionally speaking, without necessarily turning it into a full dictionary. But I'd be interested to hear y'all's thoughts about starting out, how do games provide or provoke narrative across the different forms of games, video games, tabletop RPGs, board and card games, whichever way you would like to take that. Anne, you want to start us off with some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the interesting questions this prompted is, where does a game provide narrative that isn't the standard plot? Because there are games that are very railroaded, where you have a specific path through a world and things happen. But there's also games that don't that are more sandboxy. Um, like a strategy game or a deck builder. But those can still provide narrative from, I think, a couple different places in a couple different ways. One of which is the kind of incidental, world building details, like the descriptions on a card, or a famous example is the technology voiceovers for Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. Those kind of provided a meta narrative for the strategy sandbox. And then there's also the narrative that the player constructs as they go through the game. And I think that you see that a lot with tabletop RPGs, but pretty much any game has a narrative for how it went, how I experienced it. Did I win, or what strategies did I use, or how did I get to the end? And that's going to be unique because it's going to depend a lot on what the player brings and what their own choices within the game are.
Valerie?
Yeah, so I think that when it comes to non-narrative stuff, style will account for a lot. And some people will lump style in as a part of narrative, and I think it is a part of narrative, but I think it is one of those things that can exist sort of without narrative, I guess. And so style, aesthetic, art, vibes, all of that basically can serve to make a game speculative without giving it an actual, you don't necessarily have characters, you don't necessarily have a fully developed setting, but nevertheless, you have these elements that work together to form some sort of cohesive notion of a thing being speculative. I'm going to call out the most bizarre thing, which I think it does actually end up having a narrative now, more so than it did back in the day. Candyland. Candyland is absolutely speculative. It is a fantasy game. You are a living candy creature that is making your way through this candy world trying to reach King Candy. And so like it's speculative, but does it have a plot? Does it have characters beyond a tiny figure that is a little, marshmallow? Like, not necessarily. It will have what you bring to it. It will have what you give to it. And I think recently they have developed a more robust narrative for it that wasn't existing back in the day. But nevertheless, it's a fantasy game. It's speculative.
That's a really
Right.
interesting point, especially about the art. Um, I feel like art can bring a speculative element to a game that wouldn't otherwise have it. Like I'm thinking of that pinball game that came bundled in with every version of Windows XP. It was, a space cadet pinball game. It's pinball. There's no narrative, besides like, I hit the ball, I hit this other thing. Um, but it still is speculative in the sense that it has, speculative elements. Um, and then Candyland's an interesting example because I feel like some of um, the speculative elements come from the like the just the text on the box, the manual, the instructions, and I think that unfortunately we don't see cool manuals as much in at least on computer and console games. That we definitely see that with tabletop games where the guides have their own kind of uh, you know, lore that they add that then players can build on. Um,
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about sort of the extra-diegetic materials providing additional, like everything from box art to splash screens to instruction text. I certainly grew up in the time where, because of the size of, especially like computer games, you would get the big book and it'd be like, read paragraph 87. That's where your story is going to be. We can't put it in here. Too much text.
Mm.
So I feel like we're starting to touch on some interesting things in terms of how games provide world building. What are speculative elements that you see, and how much of it do you think are vibes or furniture? Like what would you point at and say, yeah, that makes something speculative when it comes to a game? And if you've got specific examples, I'd love to hear it since I'm putting you all on the spot like this.
well, one thing comes to mind that kind of combines the mechanics of the game with the narrative and the speculative elements is um, anytime a game has like progression where you unlock certain abilities or even like SimCity or various city builders like that have a progression of things that you unlock, and not only does that provide a narrative, it provides a kind of path through the game. I unlocked this and I built that and I unlocked this and I achieved that, which is in itself a form of narrative that the player can create. But those elements often are speculative. Thinking of SimCity, they had fusion reactors, they had arcologies that you could unlock, or oftentimes in um, like there's a deck builder that I know of where the cards, the descriptions are where the speculative element lies.
Valerie, your thoughts?
Yeah, thinking also of a game maybe like Spore, for example, where you're literally evolving a creature. You could definitely argue that that's a speculative game because you're speculating on this evolutionary trajectory. And some of it is automated, some of it is things that the game is doing, some of it is your choices within the game. What do you give to your new creature in terms of abilities and physical options, so to speak? There are other games that do similar things that are really interesting. So not leaning on that one exclusively, but definitely those are games that are speculative. And so I think that absent a narrative, again, pretty much just reiterating what Anne said, you have the mechanics of the game, you have the aesthetic of the game, and that really, either of those things can work together in whole or in part to bring things into the speculative arena.
Okay. I'd love to talk some more about the narrative side, and I've kind of got a question that I started thinking about as y'all were discussing the different ways that narrative shows up, and the way that, if you're talking about a game, you have potentially like the you that is part of the game in the game world versus you, the person, versus like the mechanics or the people who designed the game, and if there is like an overarching plot, put that together. In the absence of all of those, can you ever keep a player or players from forming their own stories? Like, I'm wondering if that's almost impossible, but I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts. Valerie, you're shaking your head. You look
Oh
very
my
skeptical.
God, there's like Tetris fiction on AO3. Like you cannot escape it. I'm sorry. Anything that might have a plot, somebody's gonna plot it. Somebody will invent a character for it. Somebody will, look into the interstitial cracks of whatever is going on and make a thing happen. We're getting a Tetris movie, but it's a documentary, so it's not quite the same thing. But like look at the world of Super Mario. Originally it was a guy saving a princess, and that's as close as you got to a narrative. It was a very linear, straightforward, point A to point B kind of system, and that's it. That's all you got. At best, you had repeated like failures in the form of your princess is in another castle, but ultimately Mario is what? I don't know, a plumber. The princess is what? Princess of the Mushroom Kingdom. There's very little to work with there, and yet look where we are with it now. Not just in terms of what people came up with for themselves, but what developed canonically through Nintendo's writing and universe building.
So, I mean, you ask, like, can you prevent players from forming their own narrative? And I would say, why would you ever want to? Like, that's, uh, uh, I feel like that's the thing that really shines about, interactive fiction, tabletop games, is, compared to, um, literature or movies, it's, I mean, people can form their own narratives for literature and movies. If you look at fan fiction, that's an example. But I feel like games provide a direct way for the player to create their own narrative. That's one of the advantages of games is that it gives the player the tools to form their own narrative. Because when we talk about games, often the most compelling part of it is choice. Um, Whether that's interactive fiction, where you're choosing how the interactive fiction resolves and develops, or even a strategy game where you're choosing cards, or choosing what units to build or where to move, or obviously with tabletop games, like building your own narrative kind of the point. um, so like I'm most interested in what tools can a designer or a writer use to make it easier for game for players to form their own narrative.
Yeah, you talking about coming up with stories about Mario and the Mushroom Kingdom and things like that makes me think about how people would play, especially early versions of Dwarf Fortress, a procedurally generated game that famously was just like ASCII symbols and then some messages about Dwarf Number Seven, and write almost novel length stories of their fortress and Dwarf Fortress and what all happened, and then assigning narrative to these procedurally generated things, that I think really points to we're story creatures, and story creatures are going to story.
Yeah.
Um,
And
That
look at
also that reminds
Minecraft also.
yeah. And you were saying?
that reminds me of back in the day. There's a game called Europa Universalis, and it's a pretty dry historical simulator. But people would write these elaborate after-action reports where they would develop characters within these countries, and it would be sort of a mix between historical fiction and um, something like what you described with Dwarf Fortress, where people would describe the events of the game. And it's interesting that someone could take uh, you know the basic details of the game and spin out a a narrative that's almost completely untethered from the mechanics and the details of that game, but is clearly inspired by it.
So, can you think of game examples you might point to that don't necessarily lean heavily on plot, a story that's connected and sort of presented for you to follow, but nevertheless, are you feel like they're super heavily speculative in one form or another? I see y'all thinking. I can give an example. Since I asked the question, I actually have an example in mind. If you would like me to fill this void, well, give you some time to think. Um, the game FTL came to mind, where you're on a ship and you're trying to keep it going with all the different accidents and things that can happen, and you've got all these crew members, and they can die, and then you sort of clone them, and you get a clone of them to go rush back into the fire that consumed their previous clone in the engine room. Like that, I remember when I was first playing it, it felt like such a very science fictional story. And in fact, I know Merlafferty has said that that was partial inspiration for Six Wakes. The idea of, a ship with clones, that part of the story seed came from that. So I think I was not the only one who looked at it and said, oh yeah, super speculative.
Yeah, I mean, thinking of FTL, I'm also thinking of um, that studio's next game, Into the Breach, which it's you have giant robots fighting giant kaiju, which is itself speculative. But one of the interesting things that that game does is through the mechanics of um, the I guess roguelike ish. You get defeated, you try again, or if you win, you get to send one pilot um, back to fight another um, iteration of this game. Um, they kind of did some really interesting like thematic work around the futility of operating within an infinite multiverse, because there's always going to be more universes where you haven't defeated the kaiju. But you'd only pick up that if you were like really kind of paying attention to some of the random pilot dialogue that they say when various things happen in the game, and then synthesize that with the mechanics of the game. Um, but it's interesting that they can, you know, yes, at one level it's speculative, but it's speculative on a whole nother level in a way that requires a decent amount of interpretation by the player.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so there's a couple that I'm thinking of. One of them is one I haven't played, but my husband likes a lot, which is Seed Ship, which is a similar kind of like long-term arc ship trying to find a future home world kind of game. And in similar ways to like a SimCity style game where you'll have disasters and so on. It is a game where you're exploring different planets, basically going from system to system. You have periodic disasters that you have to cope with, things like that. But the extent of the narrative essentially is just you are on this ship and you are trying to not die and you're trying to find a home. And there, to my knowledge, there are not like any characters or anything like that. It's just you're trying to do the thing. Another game that I played a bunch was Terra Genesis, which is a it's it's a planetary development sim, will we call it that? Planetary evolution, in which you control different variables in terms of the literal physical stuff of a planet in order to kind of guide the trajectory of the planet's survival. Does it have enough oxygen? Does it have enough this? Does it have enough that? It's basically a terraforming sim, more or less. And again, not really a plot or characters for the most part, but it is nonetheless a game that it feels like a very long-term, can I get this planet to survive game. And it is extremely speculative in that sense, because you can definitely turn Earth into an unlivable carbon dioxide-filled wasteland. You can turn Mars into a green, thriving planet. It's not easy, and it takes place over the scope of millennia, and it's on a cosmic scale. But that is one. I will also say, weirdly, Kleptocats? What the heck is going on with that game? Like, it feels speculative in that you are held prisoner by cats. If you get a particular item, which is a mirror, you can see that you are tied to a chair. Who tied you to this chair? Where are the cats coming from? I feel like this is some sort of alternate world in which cats are extremely intelligent, and also they have taken you hostage. That is absolutely fantasy.
Nice. Well, so I've got a lot more questions and topics I will definitely be asking. But for those of you who are watching, you are welcome to put questions into chat. If you put it in the WebEx chat box, I will see it more readily. I am checking Discord, but it requires me to go two-screened. So it will be faster and more likely if you put it in WebEx. So if and as you have questions, feel free to put those in. And sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, when I'm just thinking, to bring it back to SimCity, SimCity doesn't have a narrative, but I feel like SimCity 2000 in particular introduced a whole generation to the idea of arcologies, which is a very speculative element. And so, I think that examples like that, where, it's the real world, but you can do things that aren't, that aren't possible in, currently. So like build an arcology, that's not we don't have the technology for that, or the infrastructure for that yet. We haven't done that yet. Or, to think about like historical strategy games. In those, there's no narrative except for history, but the history itself provides kind of a counterpoint and a thematic reference point for the narrative, the alternate history narrative that the player constructs through their actions.
Interesting. So we did get a good question from in the chat, talking about how a lot of the examples that we've talked about, us as players creating emergent narratives in our head, are simulators from one style or another. Do y'all feel that that's a uniquely suited form of game to produce those kinds of player generated narratives, or can you think of other games without narrative, or certainly without perhaps scripted plots, that aren't necessarily simulation games?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are, and I'm interested in the mechanics that simulators use to let players create those narratives. I'm thinking, for example, of games like Rim World or Dwarf Fortress, where people will, you have these characters in the game that have different attributes. In RimWorld, it's generally like backgrounds, or things that stress them out, or preferences or properties. And people will, and then they, those characters will do things in the game. They'll die, or they'll fall in love, or they'll get injured, they'll lose a limb. And I think it's natural for humans, which are great at anthropomorphizing, to create stories and to care about these characters. And I feel like that's a common method, is that you have these kind of randomly generated characters with a preset number of or that select from a preset number of properties, and then you let the player generate stories based on how those characters interact in the game. And I'm really curious to see games move beyond that, and what kind of giving tools, giving the player tools to more directly choose the, I guess, character arcs for these characters. One game that came kind of close, I feel, was Wildermyth,
Hmm.
which is, I guess I'd describe it as a tactical RPG, but in between the battles, you would kind of have narrative interludes that were kind of like illustrated interactive fiction pieces that would let you flesh out the character, that would provide miniature character arcs, and so on. But even that felt limiting from a narrative perspective, because again, these little narrative interludes were all coming from pre uh, like pre-generated, pre-written pool. And so I'd be really curious to see a game that lets players, that gives players a set of tools similar to what you see in tabletop RPGs, where you can directly write the character arcs, and then there's mechanics based on that. And I haven't seen anything like that.
Hmm. Valerie, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, just sort of to what Anne was talking about, I think of a game maybe like Once Upon a Time, which is a card game that you are building the story collaboratively as with other players, and essentially you're using whatever is on your card, and the idea is to work towards eliminating all of the cards in your hand by introducing those elements into the story in some form or fashion. And that kind of game, it certainly is a speculative game. It has essentially very speculative elements that you are interjecting, speculative characters, speculative setting, set pieces, speculative objects, and you can, with all of those things, build as fantastical or as science fictional a story as you want. You can kind of take it anywhere. And so that is one kind of approach to having, it's a very sandboxy game, right? Sandbox games, sort of by their nature, can have more or less scaffolding that you can then play with however you want. Other games, like to the original question about simulators being uniquely suited, I think to to some extent, yes, because you don't have to have a story through line to have a simulator game, and yet of course all of the other aesthetic stuff can suggest speculative the nature of it. And other kinds of game strategy has been brought up, so that's definitely another one. I would say tower defense as one aspect of a strategy game, because you can absolutely have a tower defense game that does not have a plot. You are simply going from level to level doing the thing. You can have like an Angry Bird style game with no plot whatsoever, but nevertheless the Angry Birds are wearing Star Wars costumes or what have you. And so that is also an option. And there was another kind of thing that I had thought of that I was card deck builder games. You can have deck builder games without a very strong plot or strong setting. Even something like Marvel Snap, you could potentially argue, I don't think there's really a plot to Marvel Snap. Maybe there is, and I just am not that familiar. But that's another one where it's speculative because you're dealing with all of these different overpowered super characters, but it's a card game.
Yeah. I wonder if some of it is less simulation per se, but mechanics and procedural generation of some kind, so that there is the chance of serendipity rather than pre-plotted. And if you can lean on more explicitly inviting players to explicitly decide on the meaning of things. And one of the examples that came to mind as we were discussing this is the game Sense and Semiotics by Sam Cabo-Ashwell. It was up for the Nebula a couple of years ago. It's a interactive fiction game in which you're mixing perfumes and then deciding, sort of like with the whole Victorian language of the flowers, what is the meaning behind this scent? And so you start to build up, and it's clearly in sort of a fantasy-ish alt world that creeps around from some of the details of the things that you're mixing, but it both has that procedural generation and the explicit what does this mean really? And you sort of start to build a view of the world based on all of that.
Yeah, that makes me think of a technique I see often in interactive fiction, where the plot will be fairly linear or railroaded. There's not a lot of choice around like what happens and how it ends. But where you see player choice is in the meaning behind what's happening, how the characters feel about it, um, how their backstory influences it. I thought that Kentucky Route Zero is a great example of that, where there's not really any variation in what happens, but um, giving the player choice around the dialogue or kind of some of the other incidental details really helped flesh out the characters and their arcs.
So we got another question asking what steps folks can take as game devs to enable players to find a narrative in games beyond literally writing out more plot, more words. Which I guess goes back to sort of like what are techniques for communicating narrative and especially speculative narrative that aren't just, sprinkle in more plot.
I mean, I think, my approach would be to think about the tools that I use as a short fiction writer, um, and to think about ways that I can give those to a player. So when I'm writing a short fiction piece, I'm thinking about things like where is the narrative tension? What are the sources of narrative tension? What are the character arcs? What are the themes that I'm interacting with? Um, and so if I was going to enable players to find the narrative in their games, I kind of try to structuralize some of those tools, um, and explain them to the player in the way that you do game mechanics, and let them decide what they want the arc for this character to be, and how they achieve that arc, how they get there. Um, and you see that with I think some tabletop RPGs that let you define characters not necessarily by stats, but by things like flaws or backstory archetypes or stuff like that. But I'd want to take it a step further and turn the narrative itself and the meaning behind the narrative that readers bring, the kind of the emotional impact, into the realm of the mechanics. And I think I've only really seen that done explicitly in interactive fiction or games that are very inspired by interactive fiction. Um, 80 Days, I think, is an example of a game that does that a little bit, um, where your choices aren't just about where to go and what to buy and how to navigate the world, but are just as much about defining the relationship between you and Phineas Fogg.
Valerie,
I,
what are your thoughts?
yeah, I think in addition to and possibly just buttressing what Anne said, um, I think that POV sometimes, as in writing, fixes everything. And so if you have a game with any kind of a suggestion of potential POVs within it, whether that be the player POV specifically, you as the player of the game occupy this particular role, or whether it be the notion that, say, in a strategy game, you have individual soldiers, units, buildings, what have you, the idea being that in any of those given locations, people exist. They are doing the thing of the game mechanically, even if you are not visually looking at them. They are there. And so any of those particular characters can have a POV, and any of them can invite the player to inhabit that role and envision a story for that particular person. And I think people like to do that. Just looking at the Star Wars extended universe as an example, how many individual random characters do people come up with? Not just, stories for the guy in the corner at the cantina that nobody, that, whatever, or they invent original characters for it because the setting itself is broad enough and rich enough and deep enough to invite people to imagine additional stories in it. And so I think setting scope is another possible tool that people can use in a game when the scope of the setting is robust enough to encompass a variety of different stories and narratives, then it invites people to imagine those stories and narratives within. And I think that just any time that you have people who can fanfic something, then you have done your job.
So
That's
sorry, Anne.
Yeah, I mean, and talking, expanding on what you're talking about with units, I'm thinking about how people naturally, I don't know if anthropomorphize is the right word, but identify. I'm thinking about the attachment that people have to their people in XCOM. And one of the tools they give you there is that you can customize these soldiers. Give them a cigar and an eye patch, or whatever. And I think that you can take that a step further and give players not just the ability to choose skill points that directly affect game mechanics. It would be interesting to see something like XCOM where you're choosing, in addition to the skill points, something more intrinsic to that character, that arc. Oftentimes you'll see mechanics in the game where it's like, do X to unlock some reward, and I think that's an interesting that would be an interesting mechanic to turn more character focused. So make that about that character's arc. Have them, have the player be able to choose a reason why the character needs to do that thing, and then once they've done it, it doesn't just unlock their, some ability. You can have the player choose some sort of emotional response that character has at the end.
Thinking also of a game. Sorry. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was saying go. Yes, please.
There's also a game that Mike Underwood and a few other people I know have been playing recently, which is A Land Once Magic, and that is a tabletop game that is a world builder game. That is the point of the game, is you're not building characters so much as you are building a world, and so there's no narrative inherent in that. All that you are doing is designing a setting that can then be used to tell stories in, to play games in. But that in itself is still a game. You are playing the game of building this place, and having those kinds of tools and questions, the things that you would naturally ask yourself as you are building a setting, and to gamify that for other people is also another interesting opportunity. And so you can make a game that is itself a game of making a game, so to speak, and then the players are building their own narrative that way.
That's very related to the example I was thinking of that came to mind, Valerie, when you were talking about sort of scope and where you're putting your focus. I don't know if either of you have played the game A Quiet Year by Avery. I'm on the spot, so I'm not going to remember Avery's last name. Anyway, so akin to what you were describing, you are playing a community, like catastrophe, the apocalypse has happened, and you're building community, and so you draw maps and put features on there and draw cards over the 4 seasons of the year that cause things to happen, and then decide as a community what was the community's response. Perfect, thank you. It's in the chat. So you're not creating character-focused stories, you're creating a community and how the community as a whole responded to coming together and building in the face of calamity. And that certainly invites a whole lot of narrative and has the space for you to then like dive in and say, here's the people in the community moving through this. But it is explicitly focused on community-wide building rather than individual character narratives. We got another question. What are y'all's thoughts on designing in order to assist players to embrace role playing as the player character? So ways to encourage players to inhabit someone in the game.
I mean, I think that, one interesting thing you see, if you're playing, even something like a board game is, if there's preset characters, people will kind of get into those roles. And so, giving, because not everyone is going to, have the desire or the, interest in, creating a custom original character or whatever. So giving players kind of presets that they can work with, giving them the ingredients that they can, and even a recipe that they can then play off of to build their own, take on that, character or setting. But kind of, that would be my first thought, is thinking of like, what are the building blocks that I can give, kind of the, preset characters or, world building details that are like simple enough, not necessarily simple, but explicable enough that then someone can take that and build and do their own kind of yes and on top of it.
Valerie, you look pensive.
Yeah, and part of it was that I was trying to remember the name of a game I used to play a million years ago that I think it was Counter-Strike, but Counter-Strike was a game that, again, to my knowledge, did not really have much of a plot beyond you run around and you shoot other people. And yet it spawned Red versus Blue, if I'm not mistaken, which was an entire TV series, basically inhabiting those characters. If I'm misremembering what Red versus Blue is based on, I apologize profusely, but nevertheless, it is a thing that became an entirely different thing in the hands of people who saw these sort of faceless stormtrooper like soldiers and said, I'm gonna make that a guy. I'm gonna make that a person. And so basically, again, just reinforcing what Anne said, if you have characters that the player can think about, can either inhabit that character themselves in some way, or just can speculate as to who they are, why they're there, what they're doing, what's going on with them, then you're giving them opportunities. There are also just other, first-person shooter style games that have maybe very flimsy plots that similarly you customize your character and then you can decide that they have a story. So customization, like even having the default and then having some customization. I think Splatoon has a lot of like random story stuff beyond the, first person playable thing. People will make stories about their Splatoon characters, like because there is that base thing and then there's the customization that you can put on top of it. So that's one option. But again, I feel like just character design and setting design will go a long way. Having a world that people can imagine people living in, that people can imagine stories happening in. Yes, Splatoon is huge. Listen, my daughter is the Splatoon fandom. She's 5 years old and she's making up Splatoon stories. Okay, this is what you have to work with. All that you need to do is just have a game that people are enjoying playing and they will do the thing. It really is sometimes just that simple. But having interstitial spaces, you have to leave the cracks in the concrete that the seeds can fall into and sprout flowers in, because if those cracks aren't there, like if you script it too explicitly and too much, it leaves less room for people to play. So
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think,
Sorry, go ahead, please, Anne.
Yeah, I mean, bringing up multiplayer games like Counter-Strike and Splatoon is a cool thought. You know, I'm thinking of the differences between uh, the two Team Fortress games. You know, the original one, you know, well, I mean, the second one, Team Fortress 2, has all of this, like, you know, art and like narrative and like stuff that they've built around this. But what's interesting is that the original game didn't really have any of that. It was basically just, you know, some guys and you fight. But people still constructed, like, they still created characters for these, you know, just random soldier dudes. And, you know, that kind of creativity kind of, I guess, led to what we now have with Team Fortress 2. What's interesting to me is thinking about cases where, you know, the studio has built this kind of meta character narrative stuff around the game. You know, and they put it in the game in forms of the design and the art and the character barks and voices and stuff. How does that change the player's experience of the game? You know, how does it's kind of like the designers are shaping the path of least resistance for players to create their own narrative. Um, and so if you don't, if you kind of have a broad brush, you don't provide a lot of details, people will still do it, but it'll be less directed. Um, Whereas, you know, with Team Fortress 2, the archetypes are very, very clearly defined, and people do, you know, do go off script, you know, when they're doing that stuff, but a lot of it, you know, falls into what was already laid out by Valve.
Yeah, I definitely think that, like as you said with Team Fortress 1 and you know, as you said with Counter-Strike, like people will put personalities on assign personalities to what are otherwise personalityless avatars. I know that if I want to encourage that in terms of design, I try to have some specific or two specifics that are like a detail that people will hook onto and either go with or play against type. It's good if you can get the mechanics of the game to reward putting yourself into that character. And I think one of the really powerful things is to have the game world recognize how you're playing or the choices that you like. If you always hang back and somebody on your squad after a while comments on it, then you kind of feel seen. And that helps you feel like, yeah, I'm making choices about how I'm being a character in ways that the game says, I saw that. That's really cool. Well, we're getting very close to the end. Lightning round. Is there a game or two that you would suggest people check out that we haven't talked about that do some interesting either non-plot narrative building or speculative world building? Wide open, anything.
I mean, I mentioned it before briefly, but like for me, 80 days is like what I want to do. It's just doing so much in terms of the world building, in terms of giving quiet character moments. There's just a lot of nuance and really, really good writing there.
Nice. 80 Days by Inkle Studios. All right, Valerie, you're on the
Yeah, no,
spot.
I'm doing a struggle because again, it's like I feel like we've talked about probably most of the ones that I would have brought up at this point. Um, I will say, because some of them, it's like there is sort of an existing narrative structure, but you are bringing the narrative to it. A thing that I'm thinking of, for example, is Pyro Waltz by Soup, which is a really great micro RPG, and it is a mecha RPG in which you are choosing to play a character that is the sort of rival foe character of another mech pilot, and it is a very kind of specific approach to the narrative, but you are nevertheless creating that narrative yourself entirely as you're playing the game. And so it's as if you are being handed a box of Legos and instructions for how to build a Star Cruiser or a mech. I mean, that's really so that one is a really cool one. There's a fun game that I used to play that I'm not sure if it's been updated a lot recently, but it's called Academy, and it's similar to the one you were describing earlier, Stephen, in that you are combining different elements to achieve different like results, and it is an alchemy game. And so the different ingredients come together to create more or less interesting outcomes. That can be very fun, and I feel like there are a few games like that. My son has played some online as well. So if you like that kind of random putting things together game, that's the one for you.
Nice. Now, very quickly suggest an interactive fiction from a number of years ago that's very weird and very neat called Horsemaster by Tom Henry, in which you are raising these horses for show and competition in this weird dystopian land. All right, where can people find you both online and at the convention as it goes on? Anne, let's start with you.
All right, you can find me at anneleblanc.com. I'm also on Twitter, Robot LeBlanc. So tomorrow I'm going to be doing a presentation showing off my new woodworking workbench and talking about traditional hand tool woodworking, the history of Western woodworking, and showing off some basic joinery. And then I'll also be doing a reading tomorrow evening, probably reading from some epistemological quiet horror.
Nice. Love it. Valerie?
You can find me in about an hour at AV Narrative Flops and Fails. And I have a couple of other things that I'm doing over the course of the weekend. And you can find me online at ValerieValdez.com, Valerie Valdez on Twitter, and Valerie Valdez Author on Instagram.
I'm Stephen Grenade. You can find me online at linktree/SGRANADE. It links everywhere. I will be on an intermediate twine panel tomorrow and getting the science hard enough. So on behalf of Anna and Valerie and myself, thank you so much for coming. This was wonderful. Thank you for all of your attention and great questions.
Yeah,